48 kilometres. That is the whole distance between the wharves of Quebec City and a small island in the river. For 105 years, that island was the front door of an entire country, and it was locked. Every ship coming up the St. Lawrence to Quebec had to stop here first and wait to be inspected. Not some ships, every ship. Rich passengers, poor passengers, crew, cargo, mail, livestock and luggage. All of it. Between 1832 and 1937, more than 4 million people came through this one small door. 4 million. That is more people than lived in all of Canada when the station first opened. The island is about 3 square kilometres of grass, rock and elm trees in the middle of a cold river. On it, Canada built something that almost nobody has heard of. A complete town made entirely of medicine. Hospitals, wash houses, laundries, a bakery, 2 churches, a telegraph office, a school, and 3 hotels. 3 hotels with a first, second, and third class, because even quarantine was sold by the ticket you held. Here is the strange part, and it is the reason this island is worth an hour of your time. The station was built to keep one thing out of the country: disease carried in on ships. It got better at that job every single decade, until it was one of the best in the world. And the better it got, the less anyone needed it, until in 1937, it simply closed. Then, 5 years later, the same buildings were quietly reopened under a name that explained nothing at all: the War Diseases Control Station. What it actually did there is the last chapter of this story. Keep that name in mind. We will come back to it, 100 years after the first ship anchored. This is the whole history of Canada's front door, what it was for, what happened here, and what is left. If your family came ashore here, tell me the ship and the year in the comments. I read all of them. Chapter 1. The Yellow Flag. To understand the island, you first have to understand the river. In the 1830s, there was no railway across the Atlantic and no road into Canada from the sea. There was one road, and it was made of water, and it ran up the St. Lawrence to Quebec. Everything arrived that way: settlers, soldiers, priests, tools, seed, mail, money, and news from home. And so did whatever those ships happened to be carrying below decks that no one could see. Around 1830, an average of about 30,000 immigrants a year were landing at Quebec. That was a very large number for a colony whose largest city held only a few tens of thousands. Most of them came in the holds of timber ships that had carried Canadian wood east to Britain. Those ships had to come back west anyway, and an empty hold earns nothing on a return leg. So the timber trade fitted rough wooden bunks into those holds and sold the space to families. The crossing took about 45 days under sail, in the dark, on ship's biscuit and water. Now hold that image and look at what was happening on the other side of the ocean. In 1831, a disease that European doctors barely understood was moving steadily west across the continent. It was cholera, and it had come out of the Ganges Delta and travelled the trade routes for years. By the winter of 1831, it had reached the ports of Britain and then Ireland. And every spring, ships left those exact ports for Quebec, packed with people who wanted a new life. The colonial government in Lower Canada could do arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not comforting. In February 1832, months before the shipping season opened, they voted to create a quarantine station. The word quarantine is old. It comes from the Italian for 40 days, the detention Venice imposed on suspect ships. The principle was simple and very old. Hold the traveller until you can see whether he sickens. For that, you need somewhere a traveller cannot walk away from, and Canada had a perfect candidate. Grosse Ile sits 48 kilometres downstream from Quebec City in the Ile-aux-Grues archipelago. It is roughly 5 kilometres long and 1.5 kilometres wide, with high ground at one end. Most importantly, the deep shipping channel runs right past it, so no vessel could slip by unseen. There were farms on the island already, and a few families who had been quietly working the land. The government took the land, and in a few weeks of spring, the first quarantine buildings went up. They were hasty, and they were wooden, and one of them was called the Cholera Hospital. Soldiers came down from the Quebec garrison to make sure nobody left the island before they were allowed to. A gun was mounted to stop any captain who thought about sailing past without waiting his turn. The system was ready in about 10 weeks. Its first real test arrived within 8. Chapter 2. The First Summer. The ice in the river breaks up in April, and the season opens. In the spring of 1832, the first sails came up the channel and found something new waiting. A boat put out from the island, and a doctor climbed the side of the ship to look at the passengers. That inspection was the whole system, and in a normal year it took an hour or two. Anyone who looked unwell was landed on the island. Everyone else was washed and their clothing aired. The ship itself was scrubbed, whitewashed and smoked out below decks, and then it was allowed on. Nobody involved knew what caused cholera. The best doctors in Europe were arguing about it that same year. One camp said disease travelled in bad air rising from marshes, filth and rotting matter. The other camp said it passed from person to person, though they could not say how or on what. Both camps were partly wrong, and the quarantine station was built on the argument between them. On the 2nd of June, a ship called the Carricks came up the river from Dublin. The Quebec Gazette reported 2 days later that she had lost 42 of her passengers on the passage. She had also lost her carpenter and a boy of a disease the report could not name. The survivors were held, examined, cleaned, and, in the way of that first summer, released. On the 7th of June, a steamer called the Voyageur took a group of them upriver with their luggage. On the 8th of June, cholera was found in Quebec City. The station had been open for barely a month. By the end of that year, more than 3,000 people had died in Quebec City alone. Montreal was struck as well, and the disease travelled inland along the rivers all that summer. So the first verdict on Grosse Ile, delivered in its opening season, was that it did not work. It is worth being precise about why, because the reason is the spine of this whole story. Cholera is spread mostly through water contaminated by an infected person, something no one would prove for decades. A person could carry it, board a crowded river steamer, and arrive looking perfectly healthy. Washing a coat does very little about that. Airing a blanket does nothing at all. The island was performing a ritual against an enemy whose habits nobody had mapped yet. And yet, and this is the interesting part, the government did not abandon the station. Cholera returned in 1834, and the island was opened again for the season. In 1836, a Scottish-born doctor named George Mellis Douglas was made medical superintendent. He was paid 25 shillings a day, and he would run this island for a quarter of a century. Douglas was practical. He bought marshland on the island, drained it, and turned it into a working farm. He sold milk and produce to the station, which tells you how little the station was given. For 10 years the routine held. Ships came, doctors looked, most passengers went on to Quebec. Then, in the autumn of 1845, a fungus arrived in the potato fields of Ireland. In February 1847, Douglas wrote to the legislature to warn them what was coming. Chapter 3. The season of 1847. This is the year the island is remembered for. I want to go through it carefully, in the order it happened, with the numbers the registers actually give. The potato blight had failed the Irish crop in 1845 and again in 1846. By the winter of 46, hundreds of thousands of people were trying to leave the country. The cheapest passage in the world at that moment was the timber run to British North America. So the ships that had carried Canadian wood to Britain came back full of families from Ireland. Dr. Douglas had watched the first wave of them the year before, and he could see the pattern. In February, he told the legislature that the coming season would bring, in his words, a greater amount of sickness and mortality. He asked for more beds, more staff and more money, and the station opened much as before. The hospital on the island had about 200 beds. Roughly 50 more were added that spring. On the 17th of May, a ship named the Syria anchored off the island with fever aboard. The disease was typhus, which the ship's passengers and the newspapers both called ship fever. Typhus is carried by body lice, which thrive where people are crowded and cannot change or wash clothing. Nobody knew that in 1847. It would be worked out at the beginning of the next century. So the doctors on the island were fighting something they could describe precisely and explain not at all. 10 days after the Syria, the Agnes arrived, having sailed with 427 passengers. 150 of them came through the quarantine. That was the 27th of May. 4 days later, on the 31st of May, the river below the island had become a harbour. 40 ships lay at anchor with about 12,500 people still aboard them. The line of masts ran for several kilometres downstream, and the island had beds for 250. That distance between what arrived and what existed is the entire tragedy of 1847. Sheds went up through the summer, tents were pitched, churches and outbuildings were used for shelter. At the height of the season, there were around 2,500 people under care at once. 26 doctors volunteered to work on the island that season. 4 of them died there. Douglas himself caught the fever, recovered, and went back to work on the same wards. Catholic priests and Anglican clergymen served on the island in rotation, a few weeks at a time. Several of them died as well, and their names are on the island today with the doctors. Now the number, once plainly, because it belongs in the record and not in a headline. The register for 1847 records 5,424 burials on Grosse Ile. Across the whole 105 years of the station, the register lists 7,480. More than 5,000 more died on the crossing itself before any of these ships reached the island. And the season did not end at the island. It ended in the cities upriver. Quebec, Montreal, Kingston, and Toronto all opened emergency sheds of their own that summer. By the numbers, 398 ships were inspected at Grosse Ile in that single season. 77 of them carried more than 400 passengers each, which is a very large ship for that century. 73 had sailed from Liverpool, 50 from Limerick, 33 from Cork, 29 from Glasgow. 27 came from Dublin, 26 from Sligo, 24 from Bremen, and 21 from Belfast. A normal crossing took about 45 days. 26 of those ships had been at sea for more than 60. A normal detention at the island lasted about 6 days. Several ships that year were held more than 20. When the ice came in November, the season closed and the island counted what it had left. What happened next matters, because 1847 did change the rules, and it changed them quickly. There were inquiries on both sides of the Atlantic, and they asked the obvious question: how was it legal to carry people like that? The passenger laws were tightened. A ship had to give each passenger more space, more headroom, and a set ration of food and water for the voyage. The colony also raised the tax charged on every arriving passenger, and it spent the money on this island. That is how the sheds of 1847 were replaced by proper buildings over the following decade. The station stopped being an emergency and became an institution with a budget, a staff list, and a set of standing orders. And the western end of the island, where the ground rises gently toward the river, was set aside and left alone. It has never been built on since. It is mown, it is marked, and it is the reason people come here. And among what it had left were several hundred children with no parents to collect them. Chapter 4. The Orphan Lists. Every large disaster leaves an administrative problem that nobody planned for. In the autumn of 1847, the problem was children. Some had arrived with families and left the island alone. Others had been placed in the care of strangers on the crossing. Committees were formed in Quebec and in Montreal to place them. Religious orders, including the Grey Nuns, took the youngest. And in the parishes along the river, priests read lists of names from the pulpit on Sunday mornings. French-speaking farm families came forward and took the children home into houses where nobody spoke English. There is a detail here that is often repeated because it is true, and it is worth stating carefully. The families were asked to let the children keep their own surnames, and in a great many cases they did. That is why the parish registers of rural Quebec from the 1850s onward begin to fill with names like Kelly, Ryan, and O'Connor, written in French hands. How many children this happened to is genuinely uncertain, and you should be suspicious of anyone who gives you a confident figure. The documented placements run into the hundreds. Later estimates for the province as a whole run into the low thousands. What is not uncertain is the result. 2 centuries later, there are Quebec families named Ryan and Johnson who have spoken French at home for 6 generations. Now let me put you on the island for a moment, because the numbers do not tell you what this place was actually like. Picture the West Wharf on a still evening in September 1847, when the worst of the season has passed. The river is flat, and the tide is running. You can smell lime wash, wood smoke, tar, and wet grass. Somewhere behind you, a chapel bell is being rung for the evening, twice, and then it stops. Out in the channel, masts are still standing in a line, and lamps are being lit on them one by one. In the morning, some of those ships will be cleared and will go on to Quebec, and this island will never see those families again. That is the thing about a quarantine station. Almost everybody who came here left again and got on with a life. The island holds only the exceptions. 6 years after that season, in 1853, a monument went up on the island to the doctors who had died on duty. It is one of the oldest monuments of its kind in the country, and it was raised by the people who had worked beside them. Douglas stayed at his post for another decade and a half. He died in 1864 on a neighboring island he had bought, worn down by illness and by the work. He had run the station through cholera, through typhus, through smallpox, and through 28 shipping seasons. And the whole time, the thing he was fighting had never once been seen by anybody. Nobody on that island had ever looked at the cause of a single one of these diseases. That was about to change, and it changed here faster than almost anywhere else in North America. In 1869, the government handed this island to a 26-year-old doctor from Quebec City. Chapter 5. The New Science. His name was Frederick Montizan, and he had grown up in Quebec City. He had studied medicine at Laval and then surgery in Edinburgh, and he came to the island as an assistant physician in 1866. 3 years later, at 26, he was put in charge of it. He would hold that post for 30 years, and in that time he rebuilt the entire idea of what this island was for. To see why he had to, look at what had happened to the ships. In 1847, a crossing under sail took about 45 days. By the 1880s, a steamer could do it in 10. That single fact broke the old system completely. Under sail, a disease had time to run through a ship and show itself before the ship reached Canada. Under steam, passengers could be infected in Liverpool and step ashore at Quebec still looking perfectly well. So the job changed. It was no longer enough to hold people until they sickened. You had to be able to find the disease itself. And in exactly those years, for the first time in human history, that became possible. Pasteur had shown that specific organisms cause specific diseases. In 1882, Robert Koch identified the bacillus of tuberculosis, and in 1883, the organism that causes cholera. Montizan read all of it, and then he did something unusual for a colonial official. He went and learned it himself. He spent the winter of 1891 at Johns Hopkins studying the cholera organism under the microscope. Then he came back to an island in a frozen river and started rebuilding it. The first thing he did was to stop treating the island as one place. He cut it into 3. The eastern end held the hospitals and the sick. The western end took the healthy arrivals off the ships. The center held the administration and the staff village, and fences and checkpoints kept the 3 apart. People moved through the island in one direction only, from the ship to the wash house to the hotel to the boat upriver. That flow, which sounds obvious now, was the difference between a quarantine that worked and a quarantine that spread things. In 1892, he built a bacteriological laboratory on the island itself, one of the first at any quarantine station in the world. It meant that a doubtful case coming off a ship was no longer a matter of opinion between 2 doctors. You took a sample, you cultured it, and in a day or 2, you knew. Vaccination against smallpox was carried out on the wharf, on arrival, in the open air. And the detention time began to fall, which mattered enormously, because every day a ship waited cost a shipping company money. Quarantine has always been a fight between public health and freight schedules, and Montizan won his version of that fight by being faster, not stricter. By 1894, he was running every quarantine station in Canada, and in 1899, he moved to Ottawa to run the country's public health service. He retired in 1920 after 54 years of public service, and he died in 1929. The island he left behind was no longer a set of sheds and a good intention. It was a machine, and I want to walk you through it. Chapter 6. The Disinfection Building. Here is what actually happened to you, step by step, if your ship was stopped. First, the ship anchored in the channel and hoisted the signal that told the island she was waiting for inspection. Nobody was allowed off until a medical officer had been aboard. He came out by launch, climbed aboard, and asked the ship's surgeon 3 questions. What was your port of departure? What sickness did you have on the passage? And did anybody die? Then the passengers were mustered on deck and walked past him in a single line, one at a time. He was looking for fever, for rashes, for the eyes and the skin of somebody who is trying very hard to look well. If the ship was clean, she got her certificate and sailed on the same tide. Most ships, in most years, did exactly that. If she was not clean, everybody came ashore at the Western Wharf and the machine took over. The building they walked into had been put up in 1892 and it is still standing today. Inside, you undressed. Your clothes and your bags went into a numbered sack, and the sack went into a steam chamber. Those chambers were the important part. Steam above the boiling point of water kills body lice and their eggs, and body lice are how typhus travels. Everything the island had learned in 1847 without understanding it was built into that iron cylinder. While your clothes were in the chamber, you went through to the showers, and there were 44 of them. Each stall had a head above you and 3 curved horizontal bars around you. And the solution that came out of them was mercury bichloride, heavily diluted. Mercury bichloride is a poison. At the dilution they used, it was the strongest antiseptic available, and it is the reason the walls of that building are still stained. For many of the people who went through this room, it was the first shower of their lives. It was also, for almost all of them, an experience in a language they did not speak, conducted by strangers in uniform with their possessions out of sight. Interpreters worked on the wharf. The station handled Irish, Scottish, German, Scandinavian, Italian, Ukrainian, and Russian arrivals, among many others. Meanwhile, the ship herself was being fumigated, hold by hold, with burning sulfur, and her bilges pumped and cleaned. Then you dressed in your own steamed clothes, and you were sent to wait out your quarantine in a hotel. While all of this was happening, the island was talking to the mainland by telegraph, because Quebec needed to know what was coming. Every ship that passed produced paperwork. Her port, her passenger numbers, her sickness on the voyage, and the certificate that let her proceed. Those documents are why we can still reconstruct a voyage from 120 years ago, name by name. There is one more distinction worth understanding, because it is the heart of how quarantine actually works. The sick went to hospital. The healthy passengers who had travelled beside them were held separately and simply watched. They were held for as long as the disease in question takes to appear, and then they were let go. Everything else, the showers, the chambers, the laboratory, exists to make that waiting period as short and as certain as possible. And which hotel you were sent to depended entirely on what you had paid for your ticket at the other end. The 3 hotels. Between 1892 and 1914, the island built accommodation for detained passengers, and it built 3 separate grades of it. There was a hotel for first-class passengers, a hotel for second class, and a hotel for third. The building put up in 1893 was the first-class hotel until 1912, when a new and better one was built for 152 cabin passengers. The older building was then demoted to second class, which is a very 19th century way to solve a problem. Third class was where almost everybody actually went, because third class was who was actually emigrating. The first-class hotel had a dining room, a smoking room, and a veranda where you could watch the river. The third-class block had rows of iron beds, a wash-house, and a canteen. The medical logic offered at the time was that steerage passengers were the higher risk, and the commercial logic was that shipping lines would not tolerate their paying customers being mixed with steerage. Both logics arrived at the same architecture. The class system of the North Atlantic was reproduced on a rock in the river, in wood. Around the hotels there was a working village, because a quarantine station needs to be self-sufficient. There was a bakery and a laundry, an ice house, gardens, a school for the staff children, and a telegraph line to the mainland. There was a Catholic chapel and an Anglican church a few hundred meters apart, because the people passing through belonged to both. In a busy season, the island employed around 100 people, and many of them lived there with their families. Their children grew up on a quarantine station, went to school beside a disinfection plant, and thought it was ordinary. You can still see their gardens in the photographs, laid out in straight lines between the wards. And the traffic through all of this kept climbing, because Canada in those years was recruiting people as hard as it could. In 1914, about 225,000 immigrants arrived at the port of Quebec. That is the high water mark. Ships came up the channel one after another, and the island worked them through in shifts. Most detentions by then were short. A few days in a hotel, a shower, a steamed coat and a boat upriver. 4 million people in 105 years, and for the overwhelming majority of them, this island was a delay, an indignity, and a story to tell later. That is what a quarantine station looks like when it works properly. Almost nothing happens at scale on time. The days in detention had a shape to them. A doctor's round in the morning, a second round in the evening, meals at fixed hours. Letters could be written and were fumigated before they left the island, which is a detail I find hard to forget. The shipping companies paid the cost of holding their own passengers, which gave them a very direct reason to arrive clean. Children born on the island were registered in the parish books on the mainland, and a few people were married here. The staff had their own small burial ground, because people who spend a career on an island tend to end their lives there. It is a strange kind of town, a place whose entire population is either temporary or professional. And for 30 years, that town ran at the busiest immigration gate in the country. And then, in August 1914, the passenger ships stopped coming. And they did not come back the same way. Chapter 8. The Last Season. The First World War closed the North Atlantic to ordinary passengers for 4 years. When the traffic came back in the 1920s, it came back into a different world, with quotas, paperwork, and consular files. More and more of the medical examination was moved to the other end of the voyage, to the port where people boarded. It is much cheaper to reject a sick passenger in Liverpool than to hold a whole ship at anchor in Canada. At the same time, the medicine underneath the whole system was changing again, and this time it was changing against the island. By the 1920s, there were antitoxins and vaccines for several of the diseases that had once justified detention. Specialists increasingly agreed that minor contagious illnesses, measles, chickenpox, scarlet fever, diphtheria, did not need an island at all. A modern liner had a doctor, a hospital bay, and a wireless set. A modern port had a hospital 10 minutes away. And then the Depression arrived, and immigration to Canada fell to a trickle that the port could handle by itself. So the station spent the 1930s at the top of its profession with almost nothing to do. It had a bacteriological laboratory, 44 showers, steam chambers, 3 hotels, and a hospital complex. What it did not have anymore was ships full of people who needed any of it. In 1937, after 105 years, the Grosse Ile quarantine station was closed. The medical screening of arriving passengers was moved up to Quebec City, where it should probably have been for a decade. There is a pattern in this channel's stories that I keep running into, and here it is again. A place perfects the thing it was built to do at exactly the moment the world stops needing that thing done. The staff packed up. A caretaker stayed on. The gardens went to grass, and the wharves went quiet. For 4 winters, the island sat empty in the river, fully equipped, isolated, and owned by the federal government. In 1942, a boat came down from Quebec with men on it who were not immigration doctors. Chapter 9. The War Station. I want to be careful in this chapter, because parts of this record are still not fully open. What follows is what has been declassified, published in the official histories, and confirmed by researchers working from released files. Where the record stops, I will say so, rather than fill the gap with a good story. In 1940 and 41, Canada quietly began research into biological weapons under the National Research Council. One of the men pushing for it was Sir Frederick Banting, the Toronto scientist who had shared in the discovery of insulin. Banting died in a plane crash in Newfoundland in February 1941, and the program went on without him. 2 McGill professors carried it forward: Otto Maas, a chemist, and Everett Murray, a bacteriologist, and they needed somewhere to work. The requirements were unusual. They needed isolation, existing laboratories, steam plant, secure buildings, and federal ownership, so nobody had to be asked. There was exactly one place in eastern Canada that had all of those things already built and standing empty. The disinfection building was the specific attraction. Its sealed steam chambers, built to kill lice in immigrants' coats, were suitable for growing bacteria in quantity. Not everybody agreed. Charles Mitchell, Canada's chief veterinarian, argued that the island was far too close to the shore. It is about 6 kilometres from the nearest riverbank. Mitchell said such work needed to be at least 80 kilometres offshore. No suitable alternative could be found, so he was overruled, and the work came to Grosse Ile anyway. In 1942, the station reopened under a name chosen to be as boring as possible: the War Diseases Control Station. It was a joint Canadian and American establishment, and in December of that year, a committee met in Ottawa to direct it, with Murray in the chair. 2 agents dominated the work: anthrax and a cattle disease called rinderpest. Anthrax was of interest to every wartime program because it forms hard spores that survive heat, drying, and storage, which is exactly what a weapon designer wants. Anthrax was cultured on this island, and the Canadian work fed into a joint Allied program whose production plants were in the United States. Rinderpest is a different kind of weapon. It kills cattle, and a country that loses its cattle loses its food supply, and its leather, and its draft power. North America had never had rinderpest, which meant its herds had no immunity to it whatsoever. The American virologist Richard Shope of the Rockefeller Institute led that side of the work on the island. His team took a strain that had been kept alive in cattle in Kenya since 1911 and weakened it by passing it repeatedly through hen's eggs. The result was a working vaccine, cheap to make and able to survive storage, and it was stockpiled to protect North American herds. So the same island produced in the same years an offensive research program and a defensive medical success. Both things are true. None of this was public. On paper, the island was an agricultural research station, and the people on the mainland shore were told nothing at all. The story came out slowly, from declassified files and from historians who spent years pulling the paperwork apart. Some of the material is still closed. Rinderpest research continued on Grosse Ile after the war until 1957, when it moved to an island laboratory in the United States. It took decades for any of this to reach the public,
Files were released slowly, in batches, long after the men involved had retired.
Canadian historians and journalists put the account together in the 1980s and after, working from what had been declassified in Ottawa, London, and Washington. Their books are the reason the phrase War Diseases Control Station means anything at all today. I want to be plain about the limits. Not everything about that program is in the public record, and some files remain closed. Anthrax spores can survive in soil for decades, and that fact was raised out loud when the island was being prepared for visitors. What is beyond argument is the shape of it. A station built to keep disease out of a country was used for 3 years to study disease as a weapon. The same buildings, the same steam plant, the same river. And then the island went back to the only job it had ever really had, with one change in the species. From 1957 until the mid-1980s, Grosse Ile was Canada's quarantine station for imported livestock. Breeding cattle and horses brought in from Europe were held here and watched, in the buildings where families had once waited out their 6 days. Chapter 10. What the Island Keeps. In 1974, Grosse Ile was recognized as a National Historic Site. The livestock station closed in the mid-1980s, and the buildings were handed to Parks Canada. In 1993, the island opened to visitors for the first time in its history. Almost everything is still standing, which is the unusual part. This is not a ruin. The disinfection building is there with its showers and its chambers and its stained walls. The hotels are there, the chapels are there, the hospital sheds and the staff village are there. The lazaretto, put up in the season of 1847, is one of the oldest buildings on the island. On the high ground at the western end stands a granite Celtic cross, put up in 1909. It was raised by the ancient order of Hibernians, and it is 15 meters high. It carries an inscription in 3 languages, Irish, English, and French. It faces the shipping channel. The Doctor's Monument of 1853 still stands lower down near the water, and in the meadow at the western end, the ground is not quite flat, and it is marked. Rows of plain white crosses stand in the grass, and the names are recorded on a memorial nearby. The site is twinned with Ireland's National Famine Museum, a link made in 1998. People come here every summer to look for one surname in a list. Sometimes they find it. Often they do not, because thousands of the arrivals here were never written down at all. Nobody lives on Grosse Ile now. There are no permanent residents at all. Staff come out by boat from Berthier-sur-Mer for the season, and they go home in October. In winter, the wharf ices up, the shutters stay closed, and the island is alone in the river again. Think back to where we started. 48 kilometers of water and a door. For 105 years, this was the first Canadian ground that 4 million people ever stood on. They were counted here, washed here, held here, and then sent on inland to build the country. The station learned its job the hard way, one epidemic at a time, across a whole century of shipping seasons. It became excellent at it, and then it became unnecessary, and then, for 3 years, it became something else entirely. The War Diseases Control Station is the strangest fact about this place, and almost nobody outside the archives knows it happened. But it is not what the island is for now, and it is not what the island is. The ships still come up the channel every day of the season. You can stand on the hill by the cross and watch them pass. They do not stop anymore. Nobody is inspected, nobody is counted, nobody is held. The river is exactly the same width it was in 1832, and over everything that was built here, the grass has come back.
The memorial on the island lists the people recorded as dying here in the worst years. Immigrants, and beside them the employees and the sailors who died on duty. Commemorations are held here every summer, Irish and Canadian, on the same hill. Descendants come from Ireland, from Ontario, from Boston, and from the villages on the far shore. The families on that shore have their own version of this history, and they have kept it. Some of them are descended from children who arrived here in 1847 and never left the province. That is not a legend. It is in the parish registers, and it is in the phone book. Walk the island today, and it takes about 2 hours from end to end. You pass the hotels, the disinfection building, the chapels, and the hospital row. And at the far end there is grass, and the cross, and the sound of the river. The station is quiet now. The names remain. If your family passed through Grosse Ile, or if you have worked on that island, tell me the name and the year in the comments below. I read every single one.